Hey guys, this is miicrow. The devs have made a recent video in which they described how they're going to be changing resilient to no longer being a actual perk that you have, that is instead going to be replaced by a health perk, and this resilient kind of crit damage mitigation factor is going to be baked into armor, so that people aren't going to necessarily be blown up by weapons like the fire staff with a very high crit damage multiplier, but some classes may struggle versus those matchups more so. So this kind of opens up the door to certain weapons countering certain classes a little bit more so, and I wanted to talk about where I think light, medium, and heavy are now and how I think this will kind of change the meta. To be frank, I don't think this is going to change the meta significantly if there's not other changes put into place, but I could see the return of certain classes like bows, muskets, and fire staffs being used to counter healers, which are sort of forced to run these light armor classes because of the baked in heal bonus that those light classes have. So you're going to get a meta that is more so focused on killing the healers by putting pressure on the healers. That's going to deny heavier players who are more tanky from getting healed, and that in turn is going to kind of structure how the meta is going to work. In terms of like an ideal of like where I would think that the New World meta should be, just based off the classes and off their kind of proposed standpoints, I'd say light is generally ideally a more skirmishy class. Medium is a class that is able to increase its effective HP by dodging and preventing damage, and heavy is a class that can dodge to prevent damage, although that dodge isn't typically ideal and is better used to use to counter key abilities. So you think of a clump fight where there's key situations where you need to dodge. Medium right now, you just spam dodges and you're kind of fine. And heavy, you would kind of struggle versus those situations where you have to spam dodge a little bit more so, but you gain an advantage in being able to exist in those spaces for longer periods of time. So if there's like a 5v5 happening as a heavy player, you wouldn't necessarily have to dodge those key attacks versus a medium you would. Right now, that dodging is increasing your damage, so it just makes more sense to run medium for most weapons because people typically slot an opal, which is just the easy way to consistently increase your DPS output, and you can pretty consistently have to dodge key ability cooldowns as a medium player. Heavy, you can dodge, it's just not as viable. Blocking with heavy, I would think, would be something that would be inherent to the heavy's kit. Currently, the only class that relies on blocking is the sword and shield, and the sword and shield itself doesn't even rely on blocking damage. It actually tries to not block damage and absorb damage to their HP bar, and the aura itself is going to be mitigating more damage than that blocking does. So blocking overall as a whole is just a complete failure in the current state of the game in terms of the PvP system, and I think ideally that should be something that is very viable for at least a heavy class to take advantage of. So in reality, right now, light is played for movement, and in duels, to be honest. In duels, there's a weird situation where shirking for it benefiting, or sorry, not shirking for it, shirking heals benefiting light players more because of the plus 30% healing bonus is for some reason triggering off of that, and that's giving shirking heals an advantage in both a duel 3v3 and even OPR environment where heals are just generally a little bit harder to come by. So tricking heals has kind of been dominant there in terms of like kind of smaller scale tourneys. In OPR, if you're not killing with the healer, shirking heals can be very, very good and is just generally preferred, along with things like healthy toast. Light cannot easily be caught right now, unlike what they probably should be able to, because the way that lights have mitigated the changes to getting hit by a melee and not being able to escape, or getting slowed by an ability and not being able to escape, is by using their dodges for movement before they are hit, and then they use their abilities to disengage while they are not able to dodge as far. This means that players are effectively not affected by the nerf that Light supposedly had, to where they're not going to be able to escape if caught. So it's not like this skirmish you get, like, I take a fight, I need to leave, and I have to be like very, very scared kind of class. It's a, I'm just going to play in front of you. If you try to hit me, I'm still going to be able to get away from you because I can use my rapier to disengage with invade, get out of dodge with the Tondo, and from there, you just can't really catch the light classes. They'll just turn that into dodge rules, and you just can't really catch up if you are not a light class yourself. So, in general, light is just kind of dominant, I would say, in the most part, for the more casual base of PvP. At the higher end, I think medium is more dominant than light when it comes to the bigger scale environments. In OPR, light is still kind of dominant because the environments are too big and it just inherently favors it, versus medium will be favored in something like a 3v3 or even a 1v1 that is played in a smaller scaled environment that people can't just try to snipe each other from very far away. In a war environment, I think most classes, except for heavy, are viable right now. Light and medium are pretty much at a balance point, but it's mostly balanced by healers having to run light. But medium is still favored more in war settings than light. So the biggest counter to like light right now is those AoE slows, not the actual roots itself. So there was this change where light was given like less freedom as a passive. I think that freedom passive should probably affect or have like a more drastic effect. I don't think roots are super consequential to the game right now. The best situation for a root in the current state of the game is I think it gets out one more dodge. Like if you root someone, they dodge and don't go anywhere and they have to dodge again. That's about your best case scenario. But other than that, I think that slow effects are in general more powerful than roots at the current state of the game because they actually affects people's dodge distance and typically last for a longer period of time. For example, unending thaw will last 2 seconds after person leaves the storm and will last infinitely while that storm is still up. So that's an effect that can last up to 8 seconds, where in which you have a reduced dodge uh, range, which hurts light the most because light has the longest dodge animation. That's something that I don't think there's going to be very easy to fix. But until that is fixed, I think that light is just inherently going to be supreme in most game modes. Medium is, I think, technically better in every game mode that has a healer consistently healing it, doing due to its ability to dodge key damage that is coming in, as well as dodge actual attacks, as well as like kind of having a good damage uptime. Heavy, you sacrifice 10% damage roughly overall. It turns out to be a little bit more than 10%, but it's around 10% damage that you sacrifice in turn for quote unquote being more survivable. In reality, I don't think heavy as is as survivable for most classes because they can afford to use the dodges to kind of keep their uptime versus key weapons abilities. Heavy is only slotted right now from a war setting, which I think is like fair to take as a PvP source of info. OPR would say heavy's only slotted on heavy SNS, and that's it. There's like a cheesy disruptor build that's occasionally slotted on, but that's about it. In war right now, heavy has 4 slots out of 50 in a war setting at a high level. There is one point tank that runs heavy. For obvious reasons, that makes sense. That point tank doesn't even try to block though, which I think is the most concerning part because they just try to use their uh, health bar instead to keep their stamina up so that they can give the aura that the SNS provides to nearby allies. So it's like counterproductive to how heavy as a tank should be played in a stereotypical aspect. You would think that like a heavy player would be trying to block damage. From there, that is going to like keep their HP up and they'll be able to do stuff with that. But because con is banked into the game and because tanks don't really necessarily have to do damage to provide utility, it doesn't make sense to do that. And instead, tanks are using their health bar to provide more utility with their actual stam bar itself. IGVG in heavy is also slotted on point as a usually a 3 of. A shot caller is slotted with it because it's just in general survivable build, and 2 of them are slotted as a more aggressive play near the enemy team build where they could absorb passive damage that is incoming onto them and use their dodges for key abilities. These are like the only times that heavy is like typically slotted, and even then, medium IGVG on point I would say is viable. It just requires being more creative in play style. And for other classes, I don't think heavy is nearly as entertaining because the benefits of heavy just don't outweigh the benefits of having a medium class. I don't think this resilient change is going to change that because heavy inherently struggles versus detonates, and medium kind of does better versus detonates because medium is able to use more dodges. Typically, these are chained together from like kind of a spamming effect because it will carry over that damage mitigation. I don't know if they're going to try to change that at all, but that would be like one way of approaching this change to being fixed. But I think that we're just inherently in a goats meta, quote unquote. For those of you who are not aware what I mean by that, there was a meta in Overwatch, which is a game that you may have heard of, that had lasted for a year to a year and a half. That meta had to be removed by a result of changing the fundamentals of what heroes could actually be picked in Overwatch. And this is where Overwatch is a 6v6 where you could pick any hero in the game, got reduced down to Overwatch where you had to pick two tanks, two supports, and two DPS, because it turns out that tanks are just inherently very strong. And in New World right now, our version of a tank is basically a bruiser, like a Great Axe Warhammer. They provide good damage. They provide a lot of utility with Great Axe and Warhammer that cannot be matched by any class. And the damage itself comes from using those cooldowns with a cleanse pot to mitigate the weakening effects on top of IGVGs boosting their damage at a very precise moment in time. So this is resulting in people just getting blown up from big clump fights, and a lot of the skill to in a war setting right now is just inherent to kind of macro big army play where people are inherently relying off of a shot caller's calls and trying to listen to them to create as big of a wipe as they possibly can. And it is a very positionally heavy meta that does not rely a lot on individual skill. From a competitive war setting, typically kills in a war are less than 130 minutes, or assists total less than 100 within 30 minutes. There are not a lot of people dying in a war right now. Most players in a war typically have between, I would say, 3 to 7 deaths, which is very, very low for a mode that lasts 30 minutes. And when you compare that to OPR, it's like not very comparable. OPR itself is a much bigger mode, and the respawns take longer, but the kills in OPR typically get to about the same levels as War, despite the mode being like 3 to 4 times as large overall. So I just don't think that inherently makes sense, especially for a mode that typically is less objective focused and consecrated spots. So you don't have people always fighting on the flags. It's just typically the one respawn off the start where people go to B, and then after that it gets kind of skirmishy. That's very different from war, and I think that needs to be addressed in order for something to be fixed, but I don't see that happening unless weapons are reworked in a way where they provide better utility to clumps itself. If that is not the case, I do think that Great Axe Warhammer will just be meta always, and Great Axe Warhammer typically does best in medium because of the dodges, so until those dodge changes are kind of baked into the game, I don't see this changing much. Great Axe Warhammer and medium classes in general feel very, very tanky right now because they are more or less forced to run 300 con for the passive grit. Most players that play a melee class are not willing to give up that passive grit. It's the reason why you don't see as many like light and medium melee assassin builds in the current state of the game, because if they are hit by any sort of other melee build, they typically will not get value. So instead, they have resulted in like kind of more so cheesy one-shot combo builds, which have been heavily nerfed and are trying to be removed from the game. So we're in a spot where ranged nuker-oriented builds are played in light, but no melee-oriented builds are really viable in light. So those melee-oriented builds are instead playing medium, or in very, very rare cases as sort of like a secondary tier heavy, but are not nearly as viable and heavy. So overall, these changes I think are in the right direction to make it weight based, because heavy is looking to need some love because only 4 heavy slots are used like in a war of 50 players, versus if you look at light, I believe that number is somewhere between the ranges of 12 to 15, which is fairly healthy from a war perspective. And then the high end, like a light, would be like 20 players in a war, and a medium is the rest of players. Medium is typically about 30 players in a war that are playing that class, 30 to 35-ish players. So medium overall, I would say, is the most overtuned class from a war perspective, but in an OPR perspective, it's definitely light, and I think light overall inherently is misleading in terms of how it's actually used, due to its ability to get out of situations that the kit is intended to not get out of by using abilities to escape slow cooldowns that or slow effects that are supposed to make it so that you are inherently not able to play in a fight and then kite away freely and light. So that is what I think of the changes coming up. Let me know what you guys think about this. I think they're overall heading in the right direction, but we'll have to wait and see what the big changes that unfold are to get a better grasp on the whole situation. And I'll see you guys in the next video.